Welcome back to the Backslider Diaries, the podcast for the faithful, the frustrated, and everyone caught somewhere between a pulpit and a therapist couch. I'm T.
I'm Jay.
I'm Lance.
Thank you for joining us again. We're happy to have you here. And just a quick heads up before we dive in, today's topic is not going to be the lightest of things to discuss, but it's something that's very real and something that we need to bring attention to. So we're going to be discussing the various types of abuse in churches based on our experience, and that will be covering childhood abuse, sexual misconduct, grooming, physical abuse, financial abuse, emotional and cultural abuse. So, if those are topics that are going to be difficult for you to sit with and listen to, by all means, take a break and catch us next week. We
I think we're
absolutely,
supposed to say trigger warning.
yeah, if these topics are difficult to deal with that right now, go do something and make yourself laugh, enjoy your night, and join us next week. But if these are
But
topics,
share, and subscribe anyway.
like, share, and subscribe. Like, share, and subscribe. Yes, please. Thank you. And all the things. If you're down to have this discussion, then we'd invite you to come share with us as we talk about things that are not always pleasant, but need the light brought to them.
Amen.
Amen. Just to begin, I think it's important to note that all of us have experiences with in varying degrees to with many of these topics that we're discussing today, and we know that many of you do too. I think that sadly abuse didn't get discussed, and if it did get discussed, it was only in the context of having the person who'd been abused bear the brunt of forgive and forget and turning the other cheek. But there was no real discussion of what happens, who's it happening to, what makes the church such an environment of where abuse can really grow in those corners and not be looked at, who's being held accountable. And then ultimately, if you want to go there, how do you reconcile peace with a God? And how do you especially reconcile that when it's happening at the place where faith and vulnerability intersect for so many? So, yeah, that's what we're going to talk about.
Well, it gets confusing too when they take God or religion and they use that as a tool to abuse you. But also, I think when you said that abuse was, one of the hidden secrets of the church, it also was kind of out there in the form of child abuse, in at least the way we were brought up. The term spare the rod, spoil the child was thrown around all the time. And maybe it was just the time we grew up in, not just the church. I don't know. But
Mm.
Well, I was about
there
to ask that
was there
question.
was a lot of not just spankings, not just swats on the butt, but looking back on it, just real child abuse. So
What were
I
you
think
saying,
the
Lance?
church
Sorry.
cultivated that. Oh, sorry, Lance.
No, I was just agreeing with you. Like, I think it extends beyond the church. Like, I do think it had to do with the time period. So, regardless if you were in church or not, I think corporal punishment was the norm.
Yeah, and in our particular case, I think it was fueled a little bit more by drug abuse,
Hmm.
which for a period of time, just due to some pain issues, I was having to take some opioids and really noticed how I became quite the asshole. A bigger one than I am, but I was a jerk. So I understand it, but it didn't didn't make it any better.
Yeah, and just to catch up, for those of you who maybe this is your first time joining us, T and I are siblings, and our parent, who was also the pastor of our church, amongst many other things, has an ongoing opioid addiction for all of my life since I was 4 years old. I don't really have memories prior to that being part of our family dynamic. So that was really, really part of it. And, I think you bring up a good point. You can't look at anything in isolation, right? Everything kind of has a matrix around it. And it might be important to note that we all three were raised in an evangelical setting, kind of a fundamentalist evangelical setting in the South. And we are all quite decidedly Gen X. So, that's kind of the time period that we're referencing there. And it
We're
was
not baby boomers, Gen X people.
exactly, we were raised very much. I mean, God, it was Bible to say children should be seen and not heard. We were expected to function in very adult ways. When we were growing up, we were just expected to sit on the church pew and listen. And maybe if you're lucky, you had children's church or Sunday school and you got to go, sing I'm in the Lord's army and eat your juice and cookies. But for the most part, you were sitting on the pew listening to the same sermon that adults were, which in and of itself kind of denatures the fragility from childhood, right? We weren't protected species in the way that now I think that we really do tend and try to protect our children from just the adult world, not even necessarily inappropriate content, but I think that's part of it. And I remember if you misbehaved in church, the first thing was the look. The second thing was the snap of the fingers, right? And then if you got 3 strikes, you were getting marched down the middle aisle. And by saying you, I very much mean I. I was getting marched out the middle aisle, out the back door of the church. And so many times I would have my mother would make me go pick a switch off of a bush in the front of the church. There was a little like weeping willow bush there. And I'd have to pick a switch and then she'd take me out and switch my legs and then bring back a very contrite me back into the church service. And everybody in the building would know if you had just gotten taken out for discipline. And, there that's just the least of it. And, now my mom tells that as a funny story. But it wasn't funny at the time. And not to mention at home, I know for T and I don't know for you, Lance, but I know for T and I, physical discipline was the way of it. And we were very much spanked with switches, fly swatters, wooden spoons, belts,
Belts slapped in the face.
lots of
Well, that's
belts.
that's what I wonder because I know, our perspective and how trying that was. Just Lance, I assumed growing up that's how every house was. I didn't
Yeah.
think that was out of the norm. I guess I'm sure every kid that's abused thinks that. I
Yeah.
was curious from your perspective.
Well, I had switches, belts. Always my mother, though. My dad rarely ever whipped or spanked me. I'm having a hard time even remembering once, but
Wow.
I'm pretty sure once is in there. But generally it was my mom. She was the disciplinarian. She was quick,
Mhm.
Quick draw.
very much so. And I think my last whipping, I was 15, which
Mhm.
was insane to me because I was literally looking down at her
Yeah.
while she was swinging and like, what is going on? But I was very much a rule follower. I guess that's the other thing. So I don't remember corporal punishment in all the different types of abuse. That's not really high on my list as far as the things that I need to deal with. I'm sure it's in there somewhere, some of it. Because apparently when I was 3 years old, and this is a story that's told kind of in jest, like it's funny. Like my aunts lived with us when I was 3, who was younger than my mom, and I was 3, and she was trying to spank me, apparently, and I would run and hide, and my aunt would protect me, and they would laugh because my aunt would take the whipping for me, even when I was 3.
Wow.
And so they'll talk about that, but being the rule
Substitutional
follower.
atonement.
So, but as far as the religious part, I took very much to heart about the honor your parents so that you can live long on the earth.
Mhm.
Because if you don't, you're gonna die. Like God's gonna kill you. Like that was really in my head, pretty big. So I don't know. For some reason, I was a big rule follower, but I still got a lot of spankings from my mom for apparently I didn't follow her rules. But I don't know what
Yeah,
that
and
was.
that's the thing with us is we never knew,
What the rules are.
what was going to set it off or whatever.
True.
Well, and something too that goes with that, like one variation I've heard from a lot of my friends that grew up in the same type of faith tradition. In fact, I'm thinking specifically of my first husband, who his father was very much a rule follower as well. And in their family, the rules were laid out like very specifically. If you did this, you're going to get a punishment, and that's what it's going to be. Whereas in our family, there was a lot more volatility. We never really had confirmed boundaries or set rules. It was just sort of like a landmine, you know it when you hit it kind of
Mhm.
thing. And then the punishment was fast and furious. Whereas in his family growing up, it was like, you absolutely know if you do the XYZ thing, you will get XYZ punishment. But his father was very measured and would make them pray before and after. My mother's father as well, now that I think about it, her father would make them pray after they got spanked and, ask for forgiveness and sometimes pray until they spoke in tongues or whatever the case may be, which is such a compounding, really. And it's such a, like looking at it from an adult perspective, such a weaving together of the idea of abuse and pain with the God concept, if that makes sense, and that kind of authoritarian discipline.
And in our case, it was kind of a double-edged sword there. It was not only his way or the highway here on earth, but that's how you're going to get to heaven too. And he's the prophet, he's the man who has the gifts of the spirit. He's the one that is your highway to heaven, so to speak.
Mhm.
So you're terrified. I was terrified of him. I don't even know if, you know, like, I could feel love for him if I was just so scared, and my mom too. Um, like, as a little kid, you're scared your parents are gonna die and stuff. Um, I don't know. It's really weird. I think
Well, and
a lot of that was beat out of us.
I don't know. I have to separate the two. Like my father is one thing, my mother's another.
Mm,
Their families of origin were so vastly different. My mom, in particular, came from an abusive childhood herself. So abuse begets abuse. I mean, it just
mhm.
happens. And hopefully, each generation we get a little better. That's the idea. So, and I'm not making excuses for my mom and some of the things that she has done, but I do at least want to understand where it comes from and why things maybe were the way they are. And certainly that turn that you have where you realize how human your parents really are
Right.
is
Right.
a big thing. I see my kids even going through that with respect to me. It's a hard thing to accept. And she had a horrible childhood. And this is where the religious layer bothers me because she was able to kind of go into a state of denial and that God delivered her from all of that. But there was so much there that was left untouched that got passed down to another generation
Mm.
because we didn't live in an environment where mental health and abuse was dealt with and the impact, the consequences, and it just gets passed down.
Well, that's a fantastic point, and, as you're saying that, I have to say as well, I can absolutely look at my parents and separate their humanity from their parent identity, right? And my mother grew up in extremely impoverished conditions. Her parents did not have a happy marriage, and they were a yelling family, and she also grew up in a family where her older brother and only sibling was disabled and had health challenges, and so he was kind of babied from that perspective. He almost died as a baby. And you can see how when you take it as a whole, right? You can see how all of those things together, same situation. She was a singer. She found her escape through being a musician, being able to be a traveling musician, and then eventually marrying my dad, which from her perspective, I would presume, and she shared with me too, like she grows up in poverty and in these tough situations and not a lot of familial lots of love, but not a lot of affection, not a lot of safety in that regard. And in her mind, my dad offered her all of those things. And I will say this about my parents, they certainly have their challenges. And it's kind of like when you see somebody that has a broken arm, but they never got it set properly and it just kind of grew back together in a improper way, but it works for them. And at this
Right.
point, if you
Yeah.
were to go back in and try to correct it, the arm would not be functional. His parents were silent generation. His dad was a World War II combat vet. And I'm sure that all of those things play a role and play a factor into how things shake out. But just as far as like how that translates down, when you grow up in an environment where everything is spiritualized, abuse becomes spiritualized too. And the onus of bearing that falls on the abused instead of the abuser.
Well, Lance, when you were saying how, your mom said that she was delivered from, God delivered her from the situation she was in. And, I can see that she would think that, that she's not in that situation anymore. It's really sad, number one, that people don't give themselves enough credit and they always give it to God when they're in a bad situation. And they did it,
Yeah.
they did it themselves. And that's to be commended. But what's sad is the fact that and back then, we didn't have near as many options as we do now for sure. But just like
Right.
my dad with his back, he said he was healed. He didn't nearly get the help he needed. It affected him the
Yeah.
rest of his life. Your mom said that God freed her from that, but mentally she really needed some help. She needed to go through that. It affected her and her kids the rest of
Hmm.
her life. You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
that's the one of the sad things about religion and believing in that is that you don't, number one, give yourself enough credit, and then you you say that you know God, spirit, a spirit got taken out of you, God saved you, and you don't get the actual help you need.
Right.
Well, and that also creates an environment that, I mean, we have to call it like it is, that creates an environment that continues to perpetuate abuse because You have people coming into the church, a lot of vulnerable people who have been abused or who are just, children or maybe people who don't have all the resources at their disposal yet in life. And then you have other people who are coming into this situation who are looking for a place of healing, but they still have mental health work to do, to unpack patterns or things that they need to process within themselves. That can kind of create a crucible where you're putting people with a tendency to abuse right next to people who are very, very vulnerable and
Yeah, how many
not
people do we know that were delivered from alcohol or drugs, and they would leave the church parking lot and reach behind their seat and grab their flask, and, you know,
or hit their
they
kid.
yeah, and they said they testified in church that, it's human nature, peer pressure, you're gonna lie, but they really weren't delivered from that, and it's
And they
really
start to
sad the
hide it.
damage it's done.
Yeah,
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 right. And it's
because
the
because
hiding.
of the stigma and because they've already kind of come forth as being delivered, so they've put themselves in a corner that
right.
that there's just no winning in that, and so there's a degree of humanity that's just lost where we
Right.
don't
And
recognize people are human.
there is such a thing as like a dry drunk, right? And a dry drunk, I think we talked about this before, is someone who has stopped the behavior, but they have yet to go back and work on any of the processes that facilitated the behavior or that created the behavior in their life. So, you kind of get people who are white knuckling it. And yes, they're not drinking anymore. They're not taking drugs anymore. They're not engaging in activities that harm themselves or
But
others
they still
anymore.
have the problems that caused them to
Exactly.
do that, so and
Exactly. How many of us, and how many of those that we know have been sexually abused by people in church, in a church setting? And I'll just say myself, I was sexually abused at our church by church members from the ages 4 through about 9, actively by several. And I know several other children that were in my same cohort, of peers were also being abused at that time and, in fairly egregious ways, for the sake of my own sanity and people that may be listening. I won't get into details, but, in pretty much all the ways you can imagine. And even to the extent that there were people taking images of children, of some of us that, now whenever you hear a case where they talk about discovery of CSAM. And if you don't know what that is, look it up. And every time I hear about a case like that, I have to sit there and wonder, am I in those pictures? Are people I know in those pictures? Because, those things happened. And those happened at the church where my parents were pastoring. It becomes so normalized and it becomes so equivocated. And the environment of grooming happens to such an extent. The first boy I ever actively kissed or that kissed me, I was 12 years old and he was almost 20. And actually, Lance, he attended your church. And I have to say, at the time, I had quite the crush. But in hindsight, my parents knew that this boy was pursuing me. My first kiss was actually in my parents' house where he was there to visit. There's not an environment where I would even allow my teenage or pre-teenage child to be in that setting, let alone have it kind of laughed off as
Yeah.
he, he's too old for you, but it's okay.
and the way that my father used to talk about, "You mess with my daughter, you're gonna mess with me, Texas guns,"
That
It's
didn't
just
pan
another
out, did
one of
it?
those things where all talk, no cowboy hat, And it's disappointing. I mean, not that I wanted to see him beat people up and do that, but my God, dude, I have a daughter, around that same age, and I wouldn't want a boy her age in here kissing my daughter,
Let alone a man.
It just befuddles me. You and I, Jay, we didn't talk for a while, and I left the church at a young age. I had to get out. I couch surfed. I did what I had to do. But I didn't know those things were going on, and maybe it was just me in my own little world. And I'm really sad now, looking back on it, that I didn't know that. But I didn't. I had no idea those things were going on with you. And from what you've told me now, I just cannot believe that our parents turned a blind eye to a lot of the things that went on. And they've done a lot of things that disappointed me, but that's for sure at the top of the list. And I can never forgive them for that. They probably can't forgive themselves, but they had the opportunity to do something. And as a parent, I can't imagine not. And I don't think I can get over that.
It's it's hard for me to make peace with, and honestly, there's a lot of room for personal introspection there on to an extent, boundaries are really challenging for me. It's been a lifelong journey to kind of learn that I have rights and boundaries and can say no without feeling and it's really funny because if you know me kind of in my forward facing life, I have no issue with boundaries. I have no problem telling people where I end and they begin, and things like that. But when it comes to things that harbor any element of that enmeshment that was part of life for so long, and the responsibility you feel if you have a parent that has a substance abuse issue, your roles and your dynamics get shifted anyway, and you feel kind of a responsibility. Like I've always felt like it's my job to carry the family, whether anybody implicitly expressed that to me or not. It's my job to make sure my mother's okay. It's my job to make sure that tensions between my parents and my brother aren't too extreme. So, I run in and do the sideshow and tell the jokes and, do the things and distract. And that was kind of my role in that family system. But looking more at how that played out over the years and how it continues to perpetuate in churches specifically, as I moved from my parents, they knew, but they didn't know. And we can talk later about how kind of the system of neglect of in childhood and church systems contributes to that. There's a lot to do with, like in my experience, we had people that would come through the church and I was kind of given to different people to, okay, this young female is going to come stay in our house and take care of Jay. And so they'd kind of become my de facto nanny. You have people becoming quote unquote teachers in Christian schools, becoming Sunday school providers with very little vetting. Their vetting is they got the Holy Ghost and they were at church. So therefore, they're now the head of the youth group. And that, believe it or not, is not always the best approach when you're involving adults interfacing with children. Go figure. There's very little oversight, there's very little accountability. And then when they are kind of caught or busted or called on the carpet for those behaviors, it's more about forgiveness from a spiritual perspective than any type of repair for the child and accountability for the adult. And the way that played out for me moving forward is we had a lot of evangelists come through our church in my early to late teen years when I was still at home. And, geez, how do you even say that? As though it mattered. It doesn't matter what you look like. Abuse can happen to anyone, but I happened to get my womanly body at an early age. And so that being the case, we had these ministers staying in our home. And more than once, I have had visiting preachers try to come into my room that did not have a lock on the door. There was one that pulled back the blankets and was sitting there watching me sleep. There was another one that was convinced that it was God's will for me to marry them. I was 17 and had a boyfriend, and they were 42. There was another one that I was supposed to drive back and forth to the church from our home. And this one led revivals at our church for over a year. They were staying with us. And he would put his hand on my thigh and try to kiss me. And, I'd already been kind of damaged in that way from sexual abuse as childhood. And I don't mean damage, let me clarify. By no means was I damaged goods. That's not my intention with that word. What I mean was my sense of boundaries and appropriateness and understanding how and when and where I could or couldn't say no had been sort of violated. So when that started happening at a later age, and then I was being told things like, "Don't wear." I went to a camp meeting one time, and I remember I'll never forget this as long as I live. I had on a sweater dress. It literally was a turtleneck sweater dress that went down to my ankles, and I got in trouble because other members of the church that were there thought that I was being provocative. And, so I'm getting reinforced with these ideas that you're going to lead men into sin. What you're wearing is going to cause them to lust. What you're looking like or the era that you're portraying. I was told, don't move when you sing on the platform at church because you have hips. And if you're moving your hips, they're going to start thinking sexual thoughts. And all of those things kind of congealed together into a big bubble of it's my fault that these things are happening because of the body that I have as a woman and because I exist. And so it's my responsibility to deal with these affronts and these invasive sort of moments rather than their responsibility to not act upon me in that way. And the way that that shook out for me in the end game is I wound up in a really abusive marriage. And I wound up in a marriage that had shades of all the types of abuse. And let me say, if you're out there listening and you're wondering, consent is still a valid and real thing in marriage. And you still need to have consent from both parties before engaging in grown-up activities in marriage. So don't let anybody brainwash you to the other field of thinking. But I wound up running from my life and leaving that marriage in a very traumatic way. And that's how abuse becomes generational, is because if you don't break out of the system itself reinforces that it's your fault that those things happen, and that only through forgiveness will you be free of that. And forgiveness is great, but accountability is better.
Well, I get blown away by the amount of abuse that you endured and all the creepiness that occurred, and it just blows my mind. And I hate that for you. I'm glad that you survived. I'm glad that you're in such a much better, safer place at this stage in your life. I'm thankful for that. And I can't go too far past that without just acknowledging all of that
Thank you.
and how difficult that was. My experience with sexual abuse was not, it was a one-time deal for me when I was 15. So and I didn't even remember it. I was drugged and I didn't even know it. But in my 20s, my mother told me about it happening. It gets a little fuzzy there because she's the one that brought it up. And when she told me some of the things that made her think that it happened. And I remembered the byproduct of all of that.
Mm.
I remember a bruise on my leg. I remember some other grody stuff too. But anyway, beyond that, and I didn't know what to do with that because it was my uncle, my mom's brother. And when she told me about it, when it kind of hit me with the realization of what had happened, he was already deceased. So what do you do with that?
Oh, that's tough.
So I didn't know what to do with it. And since I didn't remember it, I kind of thought for a long time it didn't affect me. And then flash forward to coming out gay, there's always that perception that gay people were abused, and that's really why. And so people started to kind of draw that connection. And the thing I always want people to understand is that predators prey on those that are perceived as weak, whether that's women, children, or gay, effeminate men, or something along those. Anyone that they feel that they can overpower or get away with, predators do that. And it's not the other way around. Gay people are not gay because they were abused in any way. And so I just hate that you experienced that for such a long period of time. I hate that it occurred to me, but I'm still kind of dealing with that, but only from the perspective of how I relate to my parents about that situation. And just going back to something you said earlier on about our parents, obviously we can't, they've made it work for them, like however it is, whatever they needed to get past their own trauma, their own abuse. And I do understand that. I can't address that, but what I can address is my own and understand. And the only thing that I just really wanted to bring out is I connected to adult children of alcoholics and dysfunctional families. And there's a
Mm.
lot of good material there that I found for me to deal with where I'm at and dealing with my own abuse and growing up. And while my mother was not an alcoholic, her father was. And so what I learned is that there's a lot of emotional and behaviors that she exhibited as a para-alcoholic. Like it just gets passed down.
Mhm.
And so the adult children of alcoholics and dysfunctional families, I mean, that's a pretty big bucket. That'll pretty much cover just about anybody. If you go through the laundry list of things that are in that material, so much of it resonates with me. And so I had to pick up from there to deal with my own abuse and trauma and figure out how am I going to heal, because I have access to so much more than my parents did. So I can actually look for mental health venues and solutions and healing. And it's a long road, to be honest. And I don't know, Jay, if you found the road to be long in healing from your own.
Yeah. Yeah, I have definitely found the road to be long and to also have what I would call kind of, we passed one the other day in this area where I live. We saw it had a warming hut, on this adventure trail that they use here in really cold weather. And I kind of see it that way, but in a different context. Like along my trail of healing, there are certain warming huts or pit stops where things have pulled me off the path, and I've had to really sit there for a while. And a lot of times there are things that I'm not anticipating. Just as an example, I have a little child who's a girl. And when she hit the age that I was where abuse started to happen to me, I noticed that I started projecting a lot and, really feeling like, no, I don't want her to wear these kind of clothes, or I don't want her to go to after school programs, or I don't want her to be where I can't see her. And I had no reasons to have suspicions of anything happening in her life. and she's been raised very much to have the language to report if anything did, and to be empowered, that this is her body. But I wasn't prepared for how profoundly it hit me when she hit that age. And I have a real hard time using child like language that speaks to the inner child or inner child healing. And, I when I saw her at that age, I started having sort of body flashbacks of feeling unsafe. And that just took me completely unaware. I was not prepared for that whatsoever. And so, yeah. And as I continue to process with my parents, I'm in a low contact kind of relationship with them. But I've had to sort of embrace the truth that I will probably never feel safe in that context, even in addressing the abuse. And no shade to them. It's look, we all are where we are, and we have to deal with what we have to deal with. But when I did finally come to them and say, look, this has been happening and this happened to me and this was a real experience. I was around 16 or 17 when I shared that with them. And the response was kind of like, well, do you want to pray about it? And I was kind of like, not really. I don't know what I was looking for, but it wasn't that. And again, nobody has a script. No parent has a rule book. So, I'm trying not to be harsh with that, but
Well, I think a couple of things from what you had said before. One of the things that stands out to me in our situation, in our religion, and the way that we were brought up, either dad is not a prophet or doesn't have God talking in his ear because God would have definitely told him there was a predator in his house, or he didn't know, or he just didn't care. And then the other thing is, I think that religion and it breeds, it's, you're taught that God forgives everything. You have people in there who'll be like, I do whatever the heck I want. God's going to forgive me. I can, So I think it kind of it leads to that, I can do whatever I want sort of mentality because God's going to forgive me. My wife and I have had discussions about that in our life. She's like, you can't just do whatever you want and ask to be forgiven. I'm like, well, that's how we were brought up.
right.
Like, not that you would want to, but God will forgive anything. So, I remember asking the question, so I could kill somebody and then right before I die, I say, God forgive me, and he would forgive me and I can go to heaven. Yep. That's.
Yeah, and I have a hard time with that, framing it, through the lens of being a survivor of that type of abuse, because I have to carry that every single day. Every single relationship I've been in, every single time. And trust me, as a woman, I will not bore you with the stories, but the amount of times, you're catcalled, you have an inappropriate supervisor at work. That's sort of the subtext of life as a woman, at least in my experience. And my challenge, going back to something that you said, and how this kind of leaked into then what I think of as spiritual abuse. I remember being 6 years old, and I don't have a lot of childhood memories, thank God, probably. But I remember being 6 and laying in my bed and praying my little 6-year-old heart out and being like, God, this is happening to me and this feels wrong. If it is wrong, please make it stop. Like, please make it stop. And it didn't stop. And so then I'm like, well, God didn't make it stop. And so it must not be wrong, but it feels wrong. And like when you're a child, your body knows when something is unsafe. And whether your brain can process that or not, your body processes it in different ways. And like, I just remember that angst as a child of if this is wrong and I'm praying for it to stop, then why isn't it stopping? And then that circle for me went back to, well, it must be my fault. Right. And being enculturated in that world that is so rife with misogyny and it is so full of appearance based things, and appearance based fronting, so to speak, isn't always just about looking good. Right. It's about, do you look the part? Is your hair long enough? Are your legs covered enough? Are you wearing the right clothes? Are you behaving in ways that appear? So it's very appearance focused, if not just looks focused. And so it was like, am I appearing in ways that are, I remember again being 6 and 7 years old and repenting for leading people into lust I didn't even know what lust was, but I knew it had something to do with making people look at you or behave towards you in ways that weren't right. And I figured I must be doing that because they were acting like this to me. And, having people that were enacting the abuse use that language and tell you things like, oh, you're sexy or you're this or you're that. When you're a child, it's is a mind F of the highest caliber. And having to kind of carry that weight and try to figure out how to operate in the world with all of this kind of corrupt code loaded into your operating system at a very young age, it's a lot to handle. And, seeing how that's played out further in life, just when you look backwards and you see the system itself is created in such a way that it's the snake eating its own tail, right? So the emotional abuse and the neglect that are kind of part and parcel of that world then become a point where you don't have a system you can report to. The sexual, we can't talk about these things and these things are sinful and we won't use these words and we won't tell you what your body parts are because you're not supposed to know that and that's worldly. You don't then have the language to report abuse. When you go to a church school and a church and it's a closed system, who are you going to report to? You don't have anyone to tell, right? And then if you do tell and you do work up the courage, then the onus of that responsibility comes back on you. Well, let's pray that you can forgive them. Let's pray for God to heal you. And you're like, that's all well and good, but what I'd really like is for someone to go kick them in the teeth and make it stop, right? Tell me it's not my fault, not that I need to pray for my abuser so I can have forgiveness towards them. And that continues to perpetuate into cycles of domestic abuse. And not to ride too much of this hobby horse, but when I was later grown and married and in an abusive relationship, an abusive marriage, I did finally report and go to my pastor and my pastor's wife. And I shared with them, like, hey, this abuse, which it was kind of one of those, again, undisclosed secrets that had become the thread of my life, whether that was our father's addiction or the abuse. But then you have people who do report and they're told, for financial reasons, hey, keep this on the down low, stay where you are. Whether that's churches not wanting to pay out, judgments against them if that was their staff, or not wanting to lose patronage by having people no longer go to the church if it comes out that there was a youth pastor doing inappropriate things. And a lot of times it turns into grooming, where you have the youth pastor who marries their constituent or whatever you call it, who's, a good 5, 10 years younger than them, that they've been grooming for years. So it becomes a very hush hush environment, which then perpetuates mental health issues, which then perpetuates addiction issues. And so it's like, it sort of becomes this self perpetuating snowball, I guess.
I don't know.
It's so much. Oh my god, it's so much. No, I do agree with the system and finding ways to break out of the system, quit playing your role. The amount of blame that was placed on you, I'm having a hard time accepting how that could go on for so long. I guess that's hard for me to imagine. However, I do think in some ways my own upbringing, I had a lot put on me to as far as being protected. I felt like my mother was overprotective. So generally I missed out on participating in a lot of fun things because she was so scared of threats. She was so scared of the devil. She was so scared of things that would seep in. And so just being isolated, and you've both used the word neglect quite a bit, and I've struggled with that concept within my own therapy, because sometimes I'm asked, like, when was the time that your parents, when you were growing up, when did you feel that way? And I can never like pinpoint some event or some conversation or some trauma, because neglect is just not being there. It's hard to pinpoint that you grew up with some degree of neglect. And that was a big part for me. I mean, church was the focus. We tagged along.
Right.
Just there. So there was a lot of emotional neglect. And so in terms of having needs as kids, being able to articulate what our needs are, having parents that could understand that and respond to that in healthy ways just did not exist for us. And so here we are at this point. How do we heal from that? How do we improve ourselves? How do we keep from passing that along to our own children? Because I find it seeping through in some ways that I don't even know how to stop it sometimes. It just seems to be happening.
Right. Right. And
And
really quickly to that point, Go ahead, T.
I think I didn't have the sexual abuse that Jay had. I like you, Lance. I had one incident happen to me, but I don't. The person was in the church, but I don't think I'm not going to blame that on the church, right? That just something that happened. And the physical abuse, yeah, that was bad. I still flinch if somebody raises their hand, that sort of thing. And I'm sure that messes with me. But the thing that has affected me the most my entire life was I don't know if you want to call it religious abuse, spiritual abuse, and just the doctrine and doctrine
Indoctrination.
indoctrination. Jeez, indoctrination that we went through has really affected me. It's affected the way I've lived. It's affected the way I'd planned for the future as a teenager. Just thinking that the world was going to end. That's what's drilled into your head. Loss of sleep, being terrified all night. I still fall asleep listening to a podcast. Paulogia, by the way, that
Hmm.
podcast is great. But I think religious abuse is overlooked as how detrimental it is and how harmful it is to people. I think that a lot of things stem from religious abuse, PTSD, the whole alphabet of things
OCD.
that are that all stems from religious abuse. And I've listened to a bunch of different podcasts and stuff, people that have left religion, deconstruction videos, all that sort of thing. And a lot of people came from really, they enjoyed religion. They enjoyed their church. They enjoyed all that. They didn't have the abuse and things that we went through. But there are a lot of us, and I think we mostly in the evangelical world, in the hardcore Christianity, Muslim, that sort of thing, where the religious abuse is rampant. So that's what I wanted to say about
No, and I think that there's go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, I just want to ask T. The bits and pieces that I've heard of your story, I keep hearing abandonment a lot growing up, and I was just curious: is that a word that resonates with you? Do you feel like that has been something that you've had to deal with, or because I don't want to put words in your mouth, but or fear of
it.
abandonment? Like, how has that played out? I guess.
I don't know if I would use the word abandonment or neglect. We were not a priority. If someone in the church needed something,
Right.
they would go and do it. For that, one example I have of this, and I'll make it quick. Dad and I were going to a fish fry, and I was excited. All my friends are going to be there. This girl I really liked was going to be there. They're going to do a crawfish boil, have shrimp, all this good Cajun food, and I was so excited. We got almost all the way there, and my dad's car phone, this is how long ago it was, car phone went off. And I remember like him stopping on the side of the road, backing up, picking up the phone, and one of the people in his church who Jay knows very well
Sure.
called. And I don't know, her alcoholic husband was on the rampage again. So the dutiful pastor turned his car around and we had to miss that event. And I understand you have to do your job. I mean, the nature of my job, I'm on call sometimes. I have to go somewhere in the middle of the night. But that was just one example of something that happened all the time where I got put in the back seat. And then, there were big gifts to make up for it, which is kind of, like the whole thing of an abuser. I'd get a horse for Christmas or, I'd get a new car when I was 16. Not a new car, but new to me.
Where was that energy from me? I never got a pony.
Well, you know, I only had it for like a year and then stuff happened. But
Right.
no, I mean that's what would happen. It was either you're getting beat or you're being disappointed or something like that, or you get a big gift all of a sudden. I think that too, Jade, when my birthday is had something to do with that.
Right, facts. Big facts. My perspective, Lance, in observing my experience and his and a lot of other folks I've known, I think there's sort of this Venn diagram where neglect and abandonment and religious abuse kind of intersect, right? And sort of the way I conceptualize this in my mind is I think something that happened, you have a parent that's really, really heavily involved in religion. I think the deity, in this case, the Christian God, comes in to be sort of the universal parent. And from their perspective, it's like, well, I may be lacking as a parent, but God, right? So instead of sitting with my child and helping them process their feelings, I'm going to pray for my child. And that'll be the answer. Or instead of taking my child to routine medical appointments, we're going to pray for them to be healed.
Well, yeah, it's like, how can you say, "I'm not loving my child, I'm providing them with a path to eternal life so we can be together
Exactly.
forever." So, really, on earth, it really doesn't matter as long as they're right with God.
Right, and I love them enough to do the hard things. I love them enough to discipline them with corporal punishment. I love them enough to take them away from being able to be, going to the school where their friends are. I wanted to play sports as a little girl very, very, very much. I wanted to play sports, and I couldn't play sports because those sports involved wearing pants or shorts or whatever, and I couldn't wear a long denim skirt.
How kind of abuse is that to, an adolescent, a kid? The fact that everybody else that you know are doing these normal Brady Bunch things that you can't do. You're totally out of the loop, and I feel like, with the whole church school, then you have religious colleges.
Mhm.
They don't want you to associate with the world because the spirit of the world might overtake you. Well, number 1, you should be shielded with the armor of God, so you should be good to go, but
Right.
what they're really worried about is you getting educated, you learning, having different experiences. I was listening to one guy saying that, he was raised it's Apologia, the podcast. He was saying he was raised a Mennonite and that, in Saskatchewan, so this real sheltered environment. And he went to work for George Lucas on the Star Wars films, moved to San Francisco, and got to meet all kinds of different people. And he was like, I met my first openly gay person, and they weren't evil. They didn't have horns. They were like, the nicest people I met. So I think that there's a real fear, too, of having your children go out into the quote unquote world and finding out that people are people, and there's a lot of nice people, there's a lot of bad people. And then also learning that this thing they told me about the year, Earth being 6,000 years old, that's not true. Just getting educated. They're terrified of education. And truth is not afraid of questions. Remember that, kids.
Right, right. Well, and here's the point too is that, whether it's the chicken or the egg, religious systems like that tend to operate in very black and white thinking.
Yeah.
And the world is not black and white. And nuance is not something that fundamentalism does well. That's why it's called fundamentalism. And there's not a lot of room for nuance. So when you start bringing in that abstract level of thought, it's a threat. It's perceived as a threat. And, kind of going back to something that you mentioned, a huge issue for me, and I don't know if I'd rank this as abuse, but it's certainly been a place of isolation that I've felt in my life. All of my peers grew up watching Star Wars and E.T. and, Goonies and like all these kind of music or movies. That was their sort of cultural bedrock. And when I'm around a group of my peers and they kind of start reminiscing about their childhood and they'll be like, oh, remember that when you saw Star Wars or remember that line from E.T. or what? And I'm like, no, I've never seen it. And 99% of the cultural touchstones from my time, I either haven't seen or I've tried to go back as an adult and revisit them. But there's an element of the mystery and the magic that's lost when you're viewing something in your 40s as opposed to when you're 8. And that's just for me always been such a place of isolation is I do not have those same cultural experiences as a huge group of my peers. And that's sort of how it feels. And I'm just curious, did you guys experience that aspect of it as well?
No, thank God. Because I'm a big nerd, and somehow I managed to go see Return of the Jedi in the movies when I was a kid.
Wow.
Because I had one aunt and uncle in particular, and for some reason my parents let me go. I don't know
Well
how this
played.
happened.
My parents were big out of town Christians. You could do things out of town that you couldn't
It's
do in town.
true.
That is, I
You
had
know
that
what?
too. That's how I saw Terminator with my parents when I was a kid.
Gosh,
You, You know what? Speaking
that's
of that,
crazy.
our mother actually took me on a road trip, T. I was 12. Oh my God, I just core memory unlocked. And she let me buy, I wanted more than anything, Frosty bubblegum pink nail polish. And she let me, I'll never forget, it was in like a little heart-shaped bottle, Bonnie Bell. And I got the nail polish. And then we went to go see Who Framed Roger Rabbit in the movies, which I was like,
Yeah.
what is happening? And I saw my parents get in a hot tub with family members, but still in swimsuits in a hot tub, and they drank a wine cooler. My dad drank a wine cooler, and I was like, "My world is disseminated. I don't know what's going on." And I remember at that time thinking, like, "So are these rules geographical or?"
Yeah. That's what F's with you as a kid. You're told these hard and fast and, well, like you were saying, these black and white rules. And when you're told those as a kid and then they go outside the black and white rules, you're like, "What the hell?" But anyway, no, I did not. So what you were saying, growing up, I did miss a lot of stuff, movies and stuff like that. But I would go and spend the night with people, specifically on like Friday night so I could watch Dukes of Hazzard. Don't get all
Nice.
on me with political correct stuff. It was awesome back then.
I love it.
But I did, like, have friends, and I would go over, and that's another sad thing too, is when I'd go over there, I would just wanna watch TV,
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
you know? But
Or we'd rent a
when
TV. We'd rent one for, like, big football games. How is that okay?
I if you got sick, mom would go rent a TV, and you could watch TV and rent videos.
That's crazy.
But we couldn't watch Star Wars because that was demonic. E.T. was demonic.
Really?
I just wanted to watch the Smurfs and Q*bert and Jim, who was truly outrageous. And if you know, you know, Jim and the holograms. Oh my
Holograms, yeah.
god, Jim, I wanted so bad to watch Jim and the hologram.
Anything like that was you couldn't do. Even though there were people in our church that were elders and stuff like that that had TVs, we couldn't do it. So yeah,
Right.
we lost out on a lot.
I know for sure. No, but I would have liked to have had some of those cultural references. And I do want to go back just really quickly and touch on neglect because I see this happen a lot. And there's also a generational shift. You know, we are as a generation much more hands-on parents than our parents were. I think we're much more heavily aware and invested in our children's mental health and their when I say social skills, I'm not just talking about writing thank you notes, but their ability to integrate into social settings and find comfort and to know their boundaries. And like, we're much more aware of that. And I do want to acknowledge there is a generational difference. However, there's a lot of things too, like parents not carrying insurance, not taking their children for regular medical and dental checkups because it's just not part of the culture. If you're working in ministry and you're working sort of an ad hoc ministry, meaning you're not part of a larger denomination that gives you a salary and a benefits package, but largely like Pentecostal, non-denominational type settings,
You're
many
working
of
on
us.
tips.
Right, you are, and we didn't have insurance growing up, so we had someone who worked for a doctor who went to our church. We didn't have insurance, and I remember being so very aware of that as a child. Same with dental care, you know, we didn't have the budget for dental care. In fact, our grandparents paid for your braces because they wanted you to have, to have braces, and
I had a jacked up mouth, yo.
I just had a sassy mouth. But like there's a lot of that type of neglect and the responsibility is put on God, right? Like we'll take it you're feeling sick, we'll pray for you. And by the same token, a lot of the raising of the children, it's like God is the invisible parent. So we're doing God's work because we're in ministry as the parents, right? So you, as the child, are going to be given to whomever can keep their eye on you in the church while we're busy. And because that we're doing righteous things for God, we're going to assume that God is and that goes to the umbrella of protection. And so, of course, the children are going to be protected from harm and they're not going to have abuse happen to them because the family is following God. And newsflash, that doesn't work. And there is sort of a benign neglect, even educationally. We don't need to teach you all the things that you would need to know to go out into the world because Christ is returning any moment now and it will be the end of the world. So who needs a 401k or a college fund because it's going to be the end of days. And so it's like all of those things sort of accumulate together and they create this system where neglect and abuse overlap. And then the financial abuse of that. Children aren't provided for in financial ways. We're not taught financial literacy, which, that's something now in my 40s. I'm trying to sit there and make sense of that because also as a woman, when I then did get married to someone who was in that tradition, even though I was earning and bringing money to the table, he, as the man of the house, ran the finances and had the final financial say. So it wasn't until I was 37 years old that I had a bank account in my name. I had to kind of go and learn all those skills. Whereas I think in the past, that mindset would have been the Lord will provide. And even now, my parents are pushing 80 and they're in extremely precarious financial situations, and their mindset is, well, God will make a way, God will provide. I have a friend who came from a different background, and going to her house and just hearing conversations at the dinner table where they're talking about, investing in this thing or that thing, or it's just a whole different mindset in that regard.
I didn't even know what to do for college, how to do anything. I did it all myself. I actually showed up drunk at my SAT,
And
still
that
got
all
into
goes to
college.
neglect, right? But
Yeah,
that all
it
goes
does.
to neglect. When you're not told college is an option and you can have opportunities, when you're not presented when you're not presented with the tools to understand how to finance college, or what does compound interest mean in terms of a student loan.
The only thing that you're taught about interest is 10%,
Right. And it goes to the big house.
and you give 10%.
So the flip side of that experience is I went to college with my mom when I started going to college.
Oh, that's right.
She was like a helicopter parent.
It's I'm telling you, it's the her own upbringing and the amount of abuse. It definitely created that environment for me. But because I went to church school, I graduated early, and they let me go to junior college when I was 15. And so I couldn't drive, so my mom went, and everyone thought we were brother and sister, and that was annoying to me. But she loved it.
I bet.
But for me, it was always that lack of a peer group. I just never had a peer group growing up. I was always expected to act more adult and hang out with the adults, especially being an only child. Just sucked. Fortunately, because of that, I mean, now my dad, his parents did not pay for college because of that very reason. There's no need. The end of the world's coming. There's no need for spending all that money. So he missed out on an education. But for some reason, I was able to get it. Like, that was important to my parents that I went to college. They didn't have money for it, but we were poor because we were in ministry. And so
Right.
grant money was amazing back then. Pell Grants that paid for my college for the longest time. So I lucked out in that way. And it's interesting that you talked about there's some nuances, but like my grandparents, my grandmother ran the money. And
Mm.
I don't know how that happened, but she was just better with it. And so my grandfather allowed her, and we had a bit of a matriarchy in that sense when it came to money. And I don't know why that is, because it is counterintuitive given the patriarchy religion that we grew up in. But my grandfather just didn't want to mess with the money, and she was good at it. So that helped.
No,
My
that's
my
interesting.
dad
Yeah.
paid the bills. I mean, my mom paid the bills
Yeah.
for sure.
Yeah. But dad
But
made the
mostly,
decisions.
yeah,
Yeah.
but
Well, true.
yeah, but I think dad looked at that as secretary's work, writing checks and doing bills. He goes and makes the money, right?
Right, right. Well, I was gonna say anything that's grunt, but we also have to say pause. Our father has an undiagnosed raging case of ADHD, which might have also facilitated mom's activities there. But no, and I mean, if you look at it and how it plays out now, like financial abuse is so rampant in the church. And especially when you get into the idea of the megachurch or the televangelist and, prosperity gospel, which we touched on a little bit last week. By the way, we missed you, Lance. Welcome back.
Sorry. Thank you.
Glad to have you. Glad you had a break, but we did miss you very
Well,
much.
just think about like when we had the revival for a whole year,
Hmm.
and people who came to that. And I think our family was probably the only ones that were there every night. But there were a
I
lot of
remember going
families
a
that,
lot, by the way.
I know. I was gonna say, Lance, you were there too.
That was a lot.
Your family was
Not
there
every
too.
night, but I do remember that.
but there were a lot of families that were, expected to be when they are there to give. And we didn't, it wasn't a rich church as far as
Mm-mm.
the congregants were concerned. I mean, we were like, and I think most churches are. They're like the Statue of Liberty. Give us you're tired, you're poor, and you're hungry. Those are the people in your church, and you're praying on them. You know, hey, God wants you, God loves you, but we really need money, and we need your money every time. And what did they do with that money? Like, what did your church do with that money? Besides have church and pay the
Right.
pastor, did you feed the hungry? Did you clothe the homeless? We didn't do any of that.
Well, to that end too, there's this whole touching back on where we came from, the love offering was very prevalent. And it was the idea that you kind of have to sing for your supper, right? And last week we touched on miracles and the supernatural. And if you could have a ministry where you had some sort of, and forgive me, I don't mean any disrespect, but there was an element of showmanship, you're going to get a bigger love offering and you're going to get a bigger crowd. right? So that in and of itself kind of creates an ethical dilemma of where does the show stop being a grift and where is it intentionally and valid and real and all those other things. But moving into where we are now in this kind of modern iteration of that, there are churches that do some things as far as outreach and that's great and that's to be commended. However, I attended a pretty wealthy church my last churching experience. It was a large church in a large church and had a lot of connections to other, like, think of some of the largest churches in the United States that you would think of that would be on TV, and they were part of those networks. And every single sermon had some sort of a financial push. And if it wasn't for a special topic, we're raising money for, we want to broadcast on this other channel. We're raising money because we want to build an addendum or do this thing or that thing. It was the implied idea of this relationship that your blessings are related to the seed you sow, and that seed is always financial. And so if you are attending a service and let's say that the push of that particular service is talking about your marriage and relationships and having you're in a bad situation and you want God to heal your marriage or to bring your wayward child home or whatever the point of the sermon could be. It could be the most altruistic thing you can think of. The end of it is going to wrap up like this. And the way you establish that faith relationship with God is branch out, sow a seed of faith right now. Plant, I don't care if it's $5 or 100, but 1,000's better. But go ahead and plant that seed and watch God match your faith. Let God show off. How many times have you heard this, right? Let God take over in your life. Give him the reins by you showing that you trust him by giving this. And it's always money. It's always money. Sow a seed and get the reward. And, frankly, I've shared this many times, but that was really the first pull of the thread of my unraveling is I'm like, this feels so transactional. This feels like such a slot machine algorithm. I don't think that if there is a God, he and or she and or they operate under the pretext of pay the price and ride the ride, right? That can't, where is there space for compassion and healing and grace and all these things that we preach from? If at the end of the day, the nuts and bolts are you have to sow a financial seed to prove something, to get something in return. And that type of financial extortion, in my opinion, has been happening since the jump. But when you add in elements of televangelism, which by the way, rest in peace, Jimmy Swaggart, and all of
I
those
have
words that I
sinned.
won't say, right? But I mean, when you get the Robert Tiltons and the praying over the envelopes, and we could just list down the line so many people to where now you have entire nouveau theology that's based on this idea that you're showing off of your riches is not showing off because it's demonstrating how the Lord has favored you, right? You're blessed and highly favored of the Lord if you have a new car and you've got a new house and God's given you XYZ thing. It's because it's a demonstration of the Lord's favor with you. And so that's become such a point of exploitation, especially with the elderly, or people that do have challenges and people that are in a desperate situation. Look who plays scratch offs, right? People who play the lottery are people who are in desperate needs of those dollars that they're putting into the lottery system with very little hope of winning. And it's the same type of dynamic. You have people that have major financial needs that are giving into churches or giving to evangelists or giving to ministries with the belief that they're going to have not the money recognized so much, but have that faith seed recognized, and then God will favor and prosper them. And that can become abusive very, very quickly.
It has. It's cost people their lives. It's cost people their houses. I mean, um, they've been grifted, and those people they just don't care. They have no compassion. They keep on doing it. They've been busted for being the grifters that they are, and they've just kept on going.
I feel a little removed from, I don't know, the televangelist world, maybe. I don't know. I haven't tracked too much of that over the last decade or more. I don't know, for the last decade or more, I'm more concerned about Fox News than I am TV10.
God,
You know,
truth.
like, I don't know, somehow I haven't been connected to folks that have been so immersed into that particular vein of prosperity gospel. I mean, we grew up in ministry. I did not feel that prosperous, by the way. You know?
No, none of us were prosperous.
That did not translate in our household, unfortunately. Or fortunately. It's probably better, right? But, I mean, there was certainly a period of my life I have extended family members that use the seed, and they're very affluent. And I told a cousin of mine one time, like, I feel like your message is to rich people. Because he was convinced I'm giving this message to help poor people so that they can become more affluent. I'm like, so your whole message is to give to get. And
Mhm.
and honestly, this broke down our relationship even before I came out, which is probably a good thing. But because we just couldn't see eye to eye on that, so that's the only place that I've experienced that is just in that familial environment. Beyond that, I haven't necessarily encountered too many people giving up their livelihood to televangelist or to ministries. Although I do know it exists. I know elder abuse exists. I know scams exist, not just in religion, but emails and texts and like all kinds of things, spam. That is very problematic, actually.
Or during COVID when and the last church that I attended had already moved to this when they started streaming services online, but they actually had a donate button at the bottom that, you can just give online
Yeah.
and pay your tithes online. And my last church experience was a large church in Miami, and Miami in and of itself has its own dynamic of appearance based phenomena. We'll leave it at that. But this particular church was really heavily connected with like the Joel Osteen and Paula White and Saddleback Church. And I think of them as Pentecostal roots, but non-denominational flowers, if that makes sense. They became very what's called seeker friendly. And
Mhm.
so everything, again, this was a point of frustration for me. Everything kind of came distilled down to like the sermons were sort of like what you would find in an Oprah magazine: 10 points to a better life, 4 points to connecting with your family. And they'd be framed through these cherry picked gospel. But then at the end, there's always the push of if you want these words to take root in your life, then you have to step out in faith, and
Mhm.
the way that you demonstrate that is by sowing a financial
Yeah.
seed. And the way that that becomes conflated for people, again, pointing to my own experience with my husband. My first husband was a former military personnel, and he had extreme PTSD and mental health issues and just some real tragic things that he was working through that of course affected our family at large. And he wanted so badly to find healing and relief for those things that were troubling and tearing apart our family, that when they would preach that message, and I mean, this man was a well educated. He had an Ivy League master's degree. He was by no means disenfranchised in that aspect. But that hook really got into him to where he thought he could give his way out of his mental health issues and give his way out of some of the chaos that we were facing in our life, to the point that he would tithe over and above from a position that left our family in a place of need. And then when I did go to our personnel, as I've mentioned, that colored the advice that I was given from a financial perspective.
Well,
And, I always look at it from the end of, if that's what happened to somebody who had all the tools and education at their disposal, what's happening to people who are in points of desperation that truly may not be able to sit with that and kind of parse out the truth versus fiction from that circumstance?
yeah. Um, I had a hard time with the giving. I could never give enough as far as like even to get to 10%. I remember this being a point of stress for me because I was always trying to get to 10%. And I couldn't do it. And then when I started having kids, it was hard for me to take money and give to the church when I know that our family, our growing family at the time, needed it. The more kids I had, it's like I had less money. And I struggled with that. And I even talked to people about it. But fortunately, I was in church environments that were not as greedy as kind of what I'm hearing you
Mhm.
say. Like, they were like, just give what you can. Like,
Well, because see
don't
what
stress about
happens,
this. Like,
it becomes a point of, I think, and having been really close to the pastoral circles in that world, and the folks that kind of become involved in leadership in that way, it becomes almost a merit badge
mhm.
of how well the pastor is doing, right? So when they get amongst their pastor friends, it's not enough to just say, well, we've had this many people come to the Lord and this many baptisms and, whatever the case may be. But it's like, no, we are blessed and highly favored of the Lord.
There,
Ergo, we are driving up in our brand new matching his and hers Escalades. I'm not exaggerating.
Yeah.
And we are living in our multi-million dollar house that, by the way, is in the church's name, so we don't pay taxes and the church payroll right? So but that becomes a way of demonstrating amongst other pastors how close to God we are because of how successful we are. So
Stat.
that
they're
pressure
keeping
then.
score with money, not souls anymore.
Right. Well, that becomes the measuring stick. And look at where we are as a country, where now, even in leadership and, some would say oligarchical people involved in government areas, we can overlook as a culture, we can overlook misbehavior because clearly they're prospering financially. And that must mean the blessing of God is upon them, right? It doesn't take too many steps for that math to math if you're in that
No, no,
system.
I hear you. I've seen it. Having family members that are affluent and going to church with them, I have seen people fall over themselves to try to
Mhm.
appease, and like it's there. I do understand that.
It's a point of exploitation. Ultimately, I think as we wrap up our conversation, you could frame it all up in the umbrella of it's exploitation.
Yeah,
And it's exploitation being done to vulnerable people in the name of God. And what broader definition of religious abuse could there be? Whether that's shifting the way a child approaches the world and embedding terrors and fears at too young of an age by exposing them to things they shouldn't be exposed to. Content wise, or telling a child that you were so bad that somebody had to die so you could be saved, or trying to manipulate behaviors or to blame the victim when they do come forward with a.
And it makes you just feel like you don't matter as a person at all.
Mhm. Well, and I mean, when you're kind of taught that, it's think of the for me, it always goes back to music. Think how many lyrics in songs that we're taught or that we sang, especially the old hymns, maybe not well, no, even some of the more modern church music, it all operates out of this perspective of I'm bad, I don't know anything.
it's a root belief that I've had to deal with. The statement that T said about not mattering, I don't matter. Like that's been a therapy belief that I've had to continually try to uproot out of my belief system.
And don't you think being children of pastors, there's a special layer to that or a secondary layer to that? Because even if you matter a little bit, you still don't matter when the rubber meets the road and the church members' needs happen first, right? Like in the larger context of the Godplex, as it were, like you've got how little you matter just in that system, but then you add to it that that can create some very complicated land to traverse.
It is.
Yep. And you're taught it in the Bible when Abraham. Boy, am I getting this right? Did I remember this
Yep,
shit stuff?
you're right, you're
When
right.
Abraham took Isaac up and was going to kill him because God told him to. That's the thing. We were taught that Bible story, and your parents are like looking at you like, "Yep, I'd kill you, dude, if God told me to."
Well, but no, but that's the implication, and I remember that story, you talk about things that terrified you, T, that one terrified me. Or there's another one, I believe it's the Sodom and Gomorrah story, where, there were people trying to do malevolent things, as it were, and one of the characters of the story offered up his daughters and was like, "Here, take my virgin daughters and be satisfied." And I very much related to that story, being non-essential and, kind of being taught like you're not special. It's the God in you that's special, right? And you're only special if you follow the rules and you're only worthy if you follow the rules. And the way that that shapes your psyche, what's not overtly taught is meant to be kind of covertly caught. There's a lot of implication there that you're better if you don't need, you're better if you don't want, you're better if you don't strive, right? But accepting what the Lord has given you and being joyful and content in that is a type of divinity. And that doesn't really shake out so well when you realize that no, you need to know how to have boundaries and you need to be able to have a voice and ask for what you need.
You're supposed to have faith, and faith is, and tell me if I get this wrong, the absence of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. No?
Hebrews, there you go.
Well, you're supposed to
So
get everything you
what's
need from God, right? I mean, that's
right?
so,
Well,
yeah.
what's funny to me is faith is basically hope, right? Hope with good intentions. But how many times have you heard it back in the Obama days? Hope is not a plan. Well, hope was our parents' plan. Hope was our parents' retirement plan. Hope was, faith. That's faith.
Yeah, their
God's going to
medical
take care
plan.
of us. So it's really ironic that some of the things that Christianity poo poos on now, hope is not a plan, cancel culture, religion's the original cancel culture.
True.
It's just funny how they project a lot. Christians tend to project a lot.
And to the last point on that, just fundamentally, when you are told overtly or covertly that your identity is shameful or wrong or sinful, whether that's, identifying as LGBTQ and not having support from that and hearing those messages that that's wrong or shameful. Or as a woman, I can say from my experience, just having a body as a woman is wrong. Whatever you may do that may be by the ruling class of manhood in that world, like objectified and seen as lustful or anything of that ilk. Or let's not even talk about the lustful. Let's talk about you're a domineering woman, you're an assertive woman, and you get called having a Jezebel spirit, right? You're trying to
Nobody
lead
ever
in the
says a man
church.
has an Ahab spirit.
There you go, right? I
Look
can't
at
tell
me
you how
talking about the
many.
Bible.
Look at you. You remember more than you thought. A plus
I've
for
been
you.
watching way too many videos.
But it comes back. And, frankly, I have a little bit of resentfulness for the mental real estate that has been occupied by beliefs I never co signed on. But I'll just say, like, as a woman, I see myself in parenting my daughters it comes out, like you were saying, Lance, things that I think that I have let go of. And I find myself having to sit there and say to myself, okay, well, no, I don't want my kid running around half naked, but how do I phrase this in a way where it doesn't imply that their body is an instrument of sin? There's so many levels of being told that your identity is wrong and then having to unpack that as
I
you
think
grow.
Lance can understand.
Yeah, no,
Like, it's something
exactly.
that is as natural to you as, heterosexual sex is to me, that something is wrong with you, that who
Yeah.
you love is wrong in our culture that's been, around that, but then you throw the religion on top of that. And like, so you had two different things to deal with your parents. Number one, just telling your parents because they're your parents, where we lived in the deep south, that's kind
Uh-huh.
of a thing. But then you throw the religion on top of that, their son's going to hell, and then they throw that onto you. That's how you must still just be dealing with that, but how you got through that and the abuse, the mental abuse that puts onto you, that even if they're not thinking
Yeah.
they're doing that, they're thinking they're doing the right thing, but they're actually hurting you.
And they don't know it.
And that's hard.
Yeah, it is. Because if they really knew, I don't think they could do it. Um, but I do appreciate that. It does, for folks with sexuality, it does foster just such a level of self hate because no one really wants to be gay. We would much rather fit in and just be heteronormative and not have to deal with the loneliness that comes from
Mhm.
it.
Hmm.
Just not wanting to be yourself. There's a lot tied in there that's just really hard to reverse. It's hard to reverse,
Mhm.
but it's a process. I'm still working on it. I had therapy today. I have therapy every week.
Good for you.
But he just, and I was kind of thinking about just the massive amount of things that I kind of have to process in order to heal from. And he's basically, it's not quite that linear. Because I'm
Right.
like, I feel like it's going to take the rest of my life because I spent half my life, over 40 years in that state and dealing with it. How do I overcome that? He's like, well, it's not linear. It's a process. And he was just trying to give me some encouragement on that, on that front.
I
No,
feel like
but
in some of the therapy I've had, I've had breakthroughs and then I've gone back, and then I've
mhm.
gone forward and then I've gone back. Just try not, I myself just try not to fall into those same mind traps that
Yeah.
make me fall back and try to learn from them. But it's a journey.
Well, you know how I kind of sum it up? And to be cheesy, I said I didn't get to watch much television in my childhood, but I do remember G.I. Joe informing us all that knowing is half the battle, right? And for me, that's sort of been the kind of like because I have my own views on things like grief and healing. I don't think they're linear. I think we want them to be linear so that we can mark how far we've come and see how far is left to go, right? But in my experience, they function much more like a spiral. And sometimes you move up that spiral and sometimes you move down that spiral, right? But I think that one of the things that got taken from us in our experience in our youth and childhood is the power of naming things and calling them what they are. And, when you cloak things under, oh no, that's not someone being abusive, or that's not the fact that we've taken someone into our home who we didn't vet properly. And now we have a reforming addict living in our house, guest preachers or whatever we've had come in that feel like they're called by God to be a pastor and now they're harming me. We're not going to call it that. We're just going to say that the devil is
Right.
tormenting you.
Yeah.
Right? And when we cloak things sort of under that, we lose the power of language, and there's power in names. And I think that the benefit of where we are now, and hopefully what things like this podcast can do, is help give people the encouragement and awareness to call things as they are, use the right words. It wasn't just that we had some challenges. We endured spiritual and emotional abuse and neglect and physical and sexual abuse and those things, and call them what they are. And I think that as we continue to do that, in perpetuity unhooks us from the chains of the language that we were given, which is a very self-blaming type of language. And it's a very nebulous kind of language. It wasn't those things. It was abuse. And we can call it like it is, and we can name it. And then we can begin to see it. And then we can begin to recognize those patterns within ourselves, with myself, whether I'm actively choosing, do I want to engage in self-harming thought, meaning continuing to think in ways that hurt me about things that happened to me? Or do I want to continue to
Yeah.
not have a boundary? That to me is where the healing happens.
You can
And
also, by naming it, I was just thinking, by naming it, you can also unlock some things to help process.
mhm,
Because by identifying it, like you said, it lets you be angry at it. Like sometimes I need to feel angry about a lot
mhm.
of it in order to get past it. And if you're in constant denial, you never even get to take those steps.
Well, and also your power of anger, what some might even call righteous indignation, is stolen from you when the onus of forgiveness is put back on you. It's kind of like putting a band-aid on a dirty wound. Yes, you've put a band-aid on it, you don't see it anymore, but the infection is still festering. And sometimes the process of getting rid of that is not a pretty process, you know?
It's
So
avoidant. It's avoidant. There's just I see a lot of avoidance in my family by its
Yeah.
statements like that. Well, let's just pray about it. Aren't we like the hands and feet of Jesus? Can't we like actually engage and talk and do things and do productive things and learn and use the knowledge that God gave us to understand and understand our psychology? I mean, just so many things.
right. Well,
Well, it
yeah,
does
at
that
some
that
point.
reminds me of faith without works is dead.
Mm-hmm.
You
Yes.
can have all the faith you want to, but if you don't do something, you know,
Right.
that and
Right.
You're
which
like the
is funny
Bible man
because
today.
that again goes back to it's you that are doing it. It's not God, it's you. You're strong enough to do it yourself. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, I
No,
was
but
just saying you're the Bible man.
he's the Bible man.
Yeah, all
That's
right.
your new nickname. We're getting you a jersey, Bible man. But no, that's a good point. Is I think that the healing starts where the passive voice ends and the active voice begins, right? Where you can sort of stop, and you have to get some tools first, but where you can stop the offloading of your emotional and mental well-being into the axioms and kind of pick that up, even if it's with baby strength. You pick that up and you recognize I am the architect of my life and I choose. Those two words for me are so powerful. I choose. If you're in that situation right now, if you're being financially abused, if you have a spouse that will not let you have any access to your finances or control, or you have a church that's trying to take your money or tell you that you have to buy your way into blessings, as we always say, you're not alone. There are resources that can help you. And, always we advocate for therapy, but if you're not in a place where you're comfortable or able to find therapy, Lance mentioned, adult children of alcoholics. It's not just for alcoholics, it applies to any system of dysfunction. Thank you for joining us. And again, if you feel like that we brought any merit to the situations which we discussed, please feel free to like, share, and subscribe so that we can continue to broaden our reach, get our voice out there. Join us on Reddit. Let us know your thoughts. Feel free to share your experiences, because ultimately our goal here is not to just hear ourselves talk. It is to build a community and a safe space where we can share our unique experiences from this world we grew up in. So thanks for joining us.
Yep. Later.
Thank you. Have a good one.
Later.
And bathe in every one of them. Some to regret, some to retell, some to forget, some